Um, Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming here today. As Michelle said, this has been 3 years in the planning. Um, and when we first began, I optimistically thought that maybe we could get 80, 100 people into a room. We have 130, and we have more people online. So thank you. Thank you all for coming. Now, um, my job here this morning is to try and introduce you all to concepts which some of you may be familiar with, some of you won't. So I'm basically trying to bring everybody into the room together so we all have a common language, a common understanding, which we can then build. So I will try. I'll probably fail, but that's entirely my fault, and I'm open to criticism afterwards. Um, yes, catch welfare is on the agenda. That's what we believe. Wild capture fisheries are important for global food security, particularly for developing nations. European consumers believe fish deserve the same protection as other production animals. And aquatic animal welfare is increasingly becoming a topic on the agenda of governments. And from my perspective, uh, there's growing evidence that poor catch welfare impacts on both sustainability and the quality of the seafood that we produce. So they're the four main things I'm going to cover this morning. Mostly the last point, but I will introduce the first 3 points to try and give some context. So many of you will be familiar with this diagram before. This is world fish production, uh, both aquaculture and wild capture fisheries. And this graph is in millions of tons. What we're talking about, and when we speak about welfare, we speak about the number of animals. And so this, in terms of wild capture, estimates are that we are currently slaughtering between zero 0.8 and 2.3 trillion animals per year, whereas aquaculture slaughters between 51 and 150, 170 billion animals per year. Billion, trillion, what does that actually mean? This is on the log scale, so we can see already catch and aquaculture dwarfs the other production animals. But when we put it on the natural or the real scale, we see wild capture absolutely dominates in terms of number of animals, global food production in terms of animal slaughter. In fact, it accounts for about 90% of animals slaughtered globally per annum. Now, what do we mean by the catch? When people talk about the catch, often we imagine what's being landed at the harbour, and that's fine. We also understand that there's illegal and unreported catches, and we have no real idea what scale that is. Some of us will appreciate that actually not all the animals that the fishing gear encounters are caught and they escape or may be released. But we don't know what that scale is either. We also have an incidental bycatch, which often is discarded because it's unwanted. We have some estimates for this. So it's between 7 and 16 million tons per annum. The bycatch can also be useful. So some elements of the bycatch can become part of the landed catch, and some might be released. Now, there's been a lot of efforts in the past 30, 40 years to reduce the number of discards by introducing different measures, which I'll talk more about this afternoon, and to increase the number of escaped and released animals. So that adds further to that sector. We also have ghost fishing. Now, this is when particular gear types, static gear types, passive gear types, like gill nets and pots, if they're lost, but they can still continue fishing, that adds to the catch as well. These are all still killing animals. And we have environmental degradation, particularly from likes of trawls and beam trawls. They can severely impact an environment, and that adds to the mortality associated with the catch as well. So we have lots of different ways of catching fish. which we will talk about, and we'll be talking about more this afternoon. Uh, the official reckoning, the FAO classification, recognises 58 different gear types in 11 broad categories. And as I said, we'll be discussing some of them later today. Now, these can be broken down into various classifications. We can see that the catch is dominated by purse seine, small scale gears, bottom trawl, and pelagic trawl. The small scale gears are artisanal fisheries, often in developing nations, and so shouldn't be ignored. They still contribute to a significant proportion of the global catch. But global catch is dominated by the industrial scale gears, particularly purse seine, bottom trawl, and pelagic trawl. And trawl, bottom, and pelagic account for over 60% of global discards. But we can't condemn any particular capture method. The capture process is a complex interaction between the capture technology, the behavior and physiology of the fish, and the environment in which it's being operated in. And an important point to remember is that each capture method is generally optimized and has been optimized over decades, if not hundreds of years, to target particular species in specific environments, which can be with respect to location, timing, and the state even of the tide, all come into important factors when we talk about catching. So we can't just pick the perfect fishing gear. It really does depend on what you're trying to target and where and when. Now, we can't just ban fishing either. Fishing is hugely important for global food security. In fact, current estimates are that seafood provides a substantial part of the daily animal protein and micronutrient intake for more than 3 billion people. So we can't close fisheries overnight like we hear some people calling for. It's not practical. It would lead to a calamity. And many of these people who are dependent on this food source, seafood, come from developing nations. So what does the general public think about fish welfare? Well, in a survey done for Eurogroup for Animals in 2019, 2020, there was 79% of the public thought that the welfare of fish should be as good as other animals we eat. So that's interesting. There is clearly public interest, and these are the sorts of factors that they felt were important: clean water, fish health. Now, in terms of wild capture, there are some points which sort of shine through that maybe wild capture lends itself to good welfare and good welfare practices, at least from a public perspective. Let's explore that a bit more. Now, these are values that people put on why they buy fish or a particular fish product. First, the most important is quality and cost, of course, but also welfare is listed, and it's quite high up, and it's amongst a collection which could be grouped as sustainability factors. And interestingly, whether it's wild caught or aquaculture sourced is also an important consideration. And in a later survey, in fact, just published this year, wild fish were interestingly perceived as ensuring wild capture was believed to ensure animal welfare and was thought to be more organic. However, but it was thought to be also more environmentally damaging. So interesting thoughts. Maybe those perspectives are correct, or maybe they're not. It's something we can explore over the next 3 days. Now, in terms of legislation and how the regulation is moving towards governing this, there's international legislation in place which is aimed primarily at aquaculture and animal health in aquaculture. But it also, so this is the World Organization for Animal Health, the Aquatic Animal Health Code. It's mostly about controlling disease in aquaculture, but it also deals with handling practices, and it specifically deals with transport and export of live animals, which is relevant for wild capture fisheries where there's live delivery. I was looking, I'm no expert on legislation, so forgive me, but I was looking for the first sort of reference to where both fish and other aquatic animals were recognised in the law. And the earliest I could find was New Zealand, the Animal Welfare Act. That was where other aquatic animals were recognised. More recently, and more famously, the UK has had the Animal Welfare Sentience Act, which recognises the fish, cephalopods, octopus and squid, and decapods, lobsters, are sentient, recognising that in the law. It's limited in its application in that it's recognising that they're sentient, but it's formed a committee which is now going to consider what impact that sentience, recognition of sentience, will have on current legislation and future legislation. So in terms of its impact in the industry at the moment, it's obviously very limited, but it's going to come. Now in Norway, we actually do already, in our Animal Welfare Act, we actually have Article 20, which says the hunting, catching and fishing shall be carried out in such a way as to be conducive with appropriate animal welfare standards. Okay, we already have something in place in Norway. However, we don't have any appropriate animal welfare standards. So it's a pretty lame article. However, it is currently being reviewed. So myself and several people in this room have already provided scientific advice towards this review of the legislation on wild capture fisheries. And so changes are likely to come into play. So I've been speaking about welfare now for I think the last 10 minutes. What do we mean by welfare? What is welfare? What is animal welfare? Well, Donald Breen, back in 1986, came up with what's thought to be one of the classic definitions, which is the welfare of an individual is its state as regards to its attempts to cope with its environment. Okay, we'll explore that a little more. And there's different positions we can take on what good welfare actually means. And those positions depend on our perspective and what we want to gain, or what we want the animal to gain from that good welfare. The first and often the most thought of is the feelings-based approach, which demands that animals should be free from negative experiences such as pain and fear, and have access to positive experiences. And there's also the nature-based approach, which is that animals should be able to lead a natural life and express natural behaviours. And there's also the function-based approach, which says that biological systems should be functioning appropriately and not being forced to respond beyond their capacity. Now, let's consider these in context with fisheries. Fisheries is an end-of-life experience for most animals which are caught in a fishing net. It's not one which is going to be a long experience for them, maybe a matter of hours. In some cases, it can be days. Most catch methods are stressful. We'll discuss that, particularly this afternoon. And so they will only have a negative impact. So we need to focus on minimizing the impact of those stresses rather than trying to promote positive experience, because that's totally unrealistic. So that sort of negates feelings-based approach. And the nature-based approach as well. You could be really perverse and say, well, the fear or the extreme stress responses that an animal experiences while it's being caught are perfectly natural. So why don't we just allow that to continue? Well, that's a little perverse. So it leaves us with the function-based approach, which gives us something scientifically constructed to work with. So we've come up with a definition, which is that good welfare practices are capture and handling methods that minimize the physical damage to and the stress on any retained fish or animal until after they are either slaughtered or released. So that gives us something to base our ideas on. And we believe that if we introduce this catch welfare, it will minimize stress and injury. That will promote the survival of any animals we release, and it will improve the meat quality. And these in turn will promote sustainability, the reputation of that particular fishery, and potentially its profit. Okay, so what do we mean by stress? Well, stress is as Hans said, it's a perfectly natural response. And we have various stresses which an animal can experience. They can be physical, environmental, or perceived. And they are perceived. They're processed in the brain, and that can lead to the first level response, neural and hormonal responses. Hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, you may be familiar with, they lead to secondary level physiological responses in the animal system. And we also have tertiary level, whole animal responses. And in this context, we'll be referring to them as behavioral responses. These collectively refer to as stress. Behavioral responses in particular allow the animal to have a quick response to try and avoid those stresses and help mitigate the other stress responses and their impact on the animal system. Now, stress is perfectly natural, and it's a function of the severity and exposure to those particular stresses. So the more exposure we have, or the greater the severity, the greater the stress response. And provided this stays within limits, it's survivable, and the animal can cope. That's what Donald Breen was leading towards. But we can reach a point where we pass a limit, and the animal systems can no longer cope with that degree of pressure. And so the animal, it will take them into a point of exhaustion, which could ultimately lead to death if those stresses aren't removed. So this suggests to us that not all stress is poor welfare. There's some degree of stress which isn't necessarily poor welfare. It is the stress that increases, that is greater than the capacity to cope, that is equal to poor welfare. That's an important point to remember. So what do we mean about stresses in fisheries? Well, with regards to capture, it could be the biological ability, the biological functionality of the animal itself, the mode of capture, the environment it's in, what seawater temperature is at that particular time, what catch size and what catch composition the animal experiences during the capture process can all add to the stress. But what we're going to do is we're going to imagine a journey now for a fish that's caught and released because it's not part of the unwanted catch. So added to these capture stresses, we also have environmental stresses due to environmental change as it's brought up through the water column. And as it's brought into the air, probably for the first time, it experiences air, suffocation, asphyxiation for the first time, and gravity. And also, if it is released, when it's released, it will be exposed to predators, seabirds at the surface, and if it manages to get off the surface, it will be exposed to predation at depth. Now, all of these lead to a cumulative stress, a compounded stress, which could eventually lead to delayed mortality, which is what we want to avoid if we're releasing the animal. So, I said behaviour is quite important, and it is very useful for us as a metric because it is an instantaneous response from the animal, and it's relatively easy to read. So, a little about behaviour. What do we mean by behavioural responses? Well, we can get individual responses, it could be swimming activity, reflexes, and whether it survives or not, what its vitality is after the experience. We can also get collective behavioural responses, and this is animals that form schools or collective groups. We can measure nearest neighbour distance, collective speed, what directions and whether those directions are coordinated. All of these things can be very informative about how functional those animals are being together. One particularly important area that's arising recently is called vitality assessment. And this is where we look at very basic reflexes or behaviours in an animal. And we bring them together as a collective score, for want of a better word. And these are just some examples, but we can bring these together, and they can be very informative and very predictive as a score for the potential survival of those animals. And this has been demonstrated in various studies now. And we'll touch on an example of those a little later on. Also, the physiological changes that go on in the animal can lead to a cascade of physiological changes in the meat that's being produced from that animal. So we can lose the energy materials in the cells, ATP, pH can drop, and we can get increased blood in the tissues. All of this can lead to poorer quality meat. And so we can have increased rigor mortis, strength of rigor mortis, lead to gaping. It can affect fillet texture, and it can affect fillet colour, all of which could reduce the potential price of your product. But also, what we've looked at recently is that it can affect shelf life. We looked at mackerel, for example, and we could still see signals 12 months after storage in the freezer that would indicate whether this fish was stressed or not just before it died. These are interesting observations which can affect the future shelf life of your products. And again, there's various publications on that now, which we can refer to later on. So, by taking this approach, by looking at the journey the animal takes through the capture process, we come up with this, what we refer to as pathway analysis, to define the likely stresses at each phase of the fishing operation. Based on the knowledge of the capture process, we can broadly assess what the likely severity and exposure are to these initial identified stresses. And we begin roughly, coarsely mapping out where they occur, what the major stresses are, so we can begin to prioritize what we need to look at. So we can prioritize our research objectives. We can begin to define informative and practical ways to measure those stresses and stress responses. And they can be contextual. We can look at injuries, we can look at physiology, and we can look at behavior in particular. And then we need to confirm this in the field. So this is a scientist speaking now. I need empirical data. I need empirical data to be able to look at the impacts both on vitality, its survival capacity, and also how it's impacting quality. Now I'm going to give you an example. This is some work that we've been doing in the Institute of Marine Research, and in particular, my colleague, former PhD student, Neil Anders over there. We've worked closely on this now for the last 7 years, and it's catch welfare during purse seine fishing. Purse seine fishing is a really interesting example. It's one of the industrial scale capture methods. It takes big catches, individual catches, but it also accounts for a large number of animals per year. It's also a highly effective capture method. It's fuel efficient. It produces relatively high quality fish. It's got a relatively low bycatch, and it has minimal seabed impact. It ticks a lot of boxes. So if we can get control over catch welfare, we could have an industrial scale fishery which is producing sustainable and good catch welfare products, which is interesting. So that's why we looked at it. So a purse seine, it's a very big net, and it surrounds a target school. And those schools are normally single species. Hence, it tends to have a low bycatch. Not every fishery does, but it does tend to have a low bycatch. Over the capture process, that net is hauled in, reduced, and the net begins to constrict the catch. They get to a restricted density, then a damaging density, and we begin to have fish-to-fish contact, fish-to-net contact. And in very large schools and very dense schools, we can begin to see hypoxia develop, lack of oxygen in the water inside the catch. And so with excessive crowding, we've got potential for physical injury and hypoxia. All of this leads to stress. Now, there's two possible outcomes. We can take the catch, it's crowded up, pump is put in, pumped aboard, and then it goes, in Norway, it goes into an RSW tank. It's pre-chilled seawater. It's normally pre-chilled to about -1 to 1.5 degrees. That will increase to about 3 degrees as the catch is pumped in. But they typically come from water temperatures of about 14 to 12 degrees, well, for the mackerel fishery anyway. But we can also release them. The catch might be too big, we need to release some of it. It's too much for the boat, it's too much for the quota. And one method is slipping. And so, as part of the work we've done, we've tried to develop catch welfare conscious slipping methods, where we can try and release the animals without reducing their survivability. I'm not going to talk too much about that today. It can maybe be discussed in the breakout session. What we do know is that if that capture process goes wrong and those fish become overly crowded, it can lead to very high mortalities in those released animals. And that can be devastating when you're releasing several hundred tons of fish from one catch. So it's really a process that needs to be well controlled. So back to here's our pathway analysis. We can see the two outcomes. We'll be discussing this more this afternoon. And you can do this for any type of capture method. So what we did is we looked at crowding in particular as a stressor. We did experiments in, well, the lab. It was a large cage out of Austerville. And we had treatments where we crowded the fish for 15 minutes by lifting the net up. We measured everything. We measured the environment they were in. We videoed their behavior and activity. We sampled fish for physiology, photographed injuries. We looked at the vitality of those fish. Now, we deliberately focused on a range of crowding stress, crowding densities to demonstrate we got a full range of mortality. But you'll see, where are we? This one. We see a lot of observations down here at low density, and we could demonstrate that even at densities up to about 100 kilograms per cubic meter, we could have close to zero mortality, which is encouraging. We also saw that vitality, this collection of behaviors, they declined with increasing exposure to crowding. This wasn't a surprise. As part of the crowding events, we saw increased swimming activity. Again, this wasn't a surprise either. Escape responses, trying to remove the animals trying to remove themselves from a stressful situation. The more crowded they were, the higher the swimming activity. This increased blood lactate, which increased lactate in the fillets, which, as I discussed earlier, that has a cascade effect, which potentially affects the quality of the meat. So we looked at that too. And we showed that in the very crowded fish, that we had reduced quality indicators. We saw gaping, we saw strong rigor mortis, which was increase in strength and had rapid onset, change in fillet colour and change in fillet texture. And as I said, we also looked at the long-term studies, and we demonstrated changes in various parameters in the fillets after 12 months storage in the freezer. So from these experiments in the laboratory or in the cage, we came up with various metrics that we could use to monitor and assess whether a capture method, the capture process, was being stressful and was potentially pushing those animals beyond their coping limit. Key to note, crowding, 100 kilograms. Safe, we designated as about 60 kilograms per cubic meter. Blood lactate, safe below 1.9 millimolar. Greater than 7.4, we were seeing acidosis. So we'll come back to these now. So we took these into the field. We took them aboard fishing boats, and we tried to measure these in the field. We used various devices and systems, cameras on the net for when we were releasing, cameras which we could deploy inside the net for monitoring behavior. That also had was monitoring oxygen, temperature changes, and we also had the same system on the pumps, which went into the catch while we were pumping them aboard. So crowding densities, you can't measure crowding density directly, but from the camera images we could come up with an approximation of crowding density, which we could relate back to what we saw in the cages. So from this, we basically audited the whole capture process, and we didn't just look at camera systems. We looked at sonar, and we populated the process at different phases, and we identified the critical areas where we had very high likelihood of poor welfare. That was pumping and slaughter. We also had issues with slipping, which won't be covered here, but I will talk a little bit more about pumping. So as I said, we had this monitoring probe which we could put into the catch, and we looked at animals both before they were pumped and after they were pumped, or during they were pumped, and once they went in the RSW tank. We looked at reflex scores, and we took blood samples from fish as they were pumped aboard, and we looked at blood lactate and glucose. We'll just here we have, it's quite a complicated figure, so my apologies, but we have time. I'm just gonna time here. We've got oxygen saturation in blue. We've got depth of the pump inside the catch. The orange points are vitality indicators, and the green points are lactate. So we can see oxygen varies a lot, but it very rarely dropped below what we consider as critical value of 40% saturation. And vitality maintained above a nominally high level for most of the pumping process until the very end. And this was typical. We saw low vitality towards the end of the pumping process. And this corresponded with an increase in lactate towards the end of the pumping process. And we saw a clear correlation between exposure time and a drop in vitality. This wasn't a surprise. This just matches what we saw in the experiments. We also saw that with increasing vitality, or with reducing vitality, we got an increase in blood lactate. There was a direct correlation between poor vitality and high lactate, and the potential for poor meat quality. And that red line indicates above that we see the potential for damage in the fillet, which we saw in the not directly measured in the fishery, but it's what we saw in our experiments. And this is work we'd like to continue with. Now, once the fish went into the tank, we see up here, this is vitality before they go in the tank, and this is vitality once they're in the tank. It doesn't take mackerel very long to die in the tank. But we also see this is lactate levels before, this is at pumping, so before they've got in the tank, and we see a doubling in lactate levels as soon as they're introduced into the tank. 10 minutes. Thank you very much. So the mere process of putting them in the RSW tank is stressful. The animals are not dying instantaneously. It's taking them several minutes to die with a very dramatic change in water temperature, which is going to be stressful for the animal, which it will try and escape from. And it will try and escape at temperatures where its muscle just does not function well, which appears to be having an impact, at least on the lactate levels and potentially on fillet quality. And yeah, here's a comparison between mean lactate levels at the pump and at the in the RSW tanks for both mackerel and for herring. We see a more dramatic response in the mackerel. So, to conclude from that particular case study, mackerel welfare can be negatively impacted by crowding during pair-seine capture, affecting fillet quality in the retained fish, and post-crowding survival and vitality of released fish. Also, cold shock and hypoxia in the RSW tanks negatively impacts welfare, as indicated by reduced vitality and increased blood lactate. This may also affect fillet quality. Future work priorities are to establish the link between welfare and fillet quality in commercial catches, introduce measures to improve welfare and maybe fillet quality. What could that be? Can we target smaller catches, reducing pumping times? That could be an interesting thing to discuss. Can we develop low-density pumping methods? And can we investigate the benefits of humane stunning and slaughter on both welfare and fillet quality? So can we stun the animals before they go into the tank? You'll be glad to hear this is my last slide. Actually, no, not quite. So, from our perspective, and this is just our perspective, we would like to hear your perspective. From our perspective, good catch welfare is not just an ethical issue. By minimising stress and injury in harvested animals, we have potential benefits for sustainable use of targeted species and exploited ecosystems, and we could potentially promote the quality and the usability of fishery products. To achieve this, we need to develop and use tools to promote catch welfare, and we need to work with both industrial and artisanal fisheries globally. And most importantly of all, we need to start thinking of the catch as a living resource, right up to the point that it's killed. It's still a living resource. It is not just a food product which we're shoveling across the deck. These are living animals, and how you treat them is going to have an impact on whether it survives or whether you get a good fillet. That brings us to our platform. As I said, this is just my opinion, our opinion. We really look forward to hearing your opinion. That's why we've brought this group together. We welcome your input, and we welcome criticism. If you think this is wrong, great. Let us know. That's exactly what we want to hear. That's why you're here. This we hope is going to be a safe environment for people to speak openly and honestly. And if you have concerns about the incoming change and the likely change in welfare legislation that will likely affect fisheries in the future, express those while we're here, so we can learn from it and we can try and build upon that. So with that, thank you very much for your attention.